parish. I'm pleased to welcome you here this afternoon, and indeed, pleased doesn't capture my sense of gratitude at seeing so many people here. Brief logistics. After the program, there will be a reception downstairs. One gets to the downstairs through the curtain over there. There's an awkwardness because the elevator is not in service, but there are stairs. That is also the way to the bathrooms. And if you are in need of the facilities and are unable to take the stairs, there is a bathroom back through the music office, which will be visible when you go through the door. This spring marks the rolling 80th anniversary of when the Soviet Army advancing from the east and the Allied forces marching from the west found and liberated the Nazis' concentration camps. We have been watching images of the world those camps destroyed, the process of the destruction, and the suffering victims as they were rescued. Today we remember those events. We remember also that they arose not only out of a national and cultural derangement, but out of a hellish failure of interfaith relations. Interfaith relations are a challenge for the devout. Every religion is based on propositions that God exists in one form or another form, that there is one God, or there are many gods, or that no God exists at all, that something happened or did not happen or will happen, that we are required to do one thing and not the other. The propositions of one religion contradict those of others, and these contradictions are substantial. They do not sit on the surface of a core of otherwise neutral values. They are folded into the heart of each faith. How do we manage, each of us, to relate to those whose hearts are differently configured? The first urgent task in a post-Holocaust world is to discard ancient hostilities and ignorance of one another. But we have other, more modest, yet painful challenges to manage that arise out of our different core convictions. Devotion to our faith may distance us from our friends. Loyalty to our friends may put our religion at arm's length. Our speaker, the Reverend Canon Masud Ibn Syedullah, has spent his life negotiating differences. He will help us envision ways at once to be true to ourselves, to maintain our integrity, and to embrace everyone around us. Father Masud is a professed member of the Third Order Society of St. Francis. Like St. Francis, he brings peace with him, and he leaves it behind when he departs. Father Masud.
Thank you, Bruce. It's an honor to be here with you today. It's a tough day, isn't it, in some ways? The scenes that we have just seen are quite challenging, and they leave us with a sense of great sadness. At once, there is the liberation, and that's good news, that people were being liberated from such a horrible situation. The Jewish people were excruciatingly experiencing harsh, detrimental, exploitative life. And they were delivered on this day, the day that's being commemorated. And at the same time, there was exposed the horror that they had endured, that they had experienced. And so today, in this time that we have together, I invite us to use this as a time of learning and a time of learning how to move forward in a healthier way. I'm going to begin with a kind of meditation. I'm going to ask you just to Become comfortable in your seats. When I was living in Colorado, I experienced the aspen trees. And I learned that the roots went deep into the ground and that they were connected underneath. There was a kind of communication that happened there. So let's begin. I'm going to ask you to either close your eyes or you may leave them open, but just kind of look forward and begin your breathing, deep breathing. Breathe in and out very deeply. A good breath in and out. I would say breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth as if you have a straw in your mouth and you're blowing the air out gently through that straw. Breathing in and breathing out. Feel the air going through your nostrils, into your lungs, and then coming out through your mouth. Just do that for a few moments. Breathing in gently and breathing out. And just listen to me as you breathe. Trees have long been a symbol of strength and of growth, of beauty, of life. But they don't exist in a solitary way. And as I think about the aspens, there are usually many, many of them together. Imagine golden leaves shimmering in the wind. Imagine yourself being one of those trees as you're breathing in and breathing out. And now imagine your roots going down deeply into the ground. Gently breathing in and breathing out, but imagining your roots going deeply into the soil and not being alone, but beginning to connect with the other roots beside you. Breathing in and breathing out. Roots take in energy from the soil, nourishment, nutrition. Allow yourself to take that energy into yourself as you're breathing in. And as you're breathing out, share that energy with the roots that you're touching of the other trees. Connected, sharing that energy together while you are rooted in the soil, the rich soil of the earth. Breathing in gently, breathing out, sharing that energy with the other roots of the other trees. Knowing that we are together, united together. Now think of yourself as yourself, connected with others beside you. You don't even know them, but they are a part of this community of life. And as you breathe out energy of care, of love, of tenderness, wanting this whole room, which is dedicated to goodness, to be filled with the goodness that you are sharing with the people beside you, in the row in front of you, the row behind you, filling this room, breathing gently in, receiving from them and breathing out, sharing with them. Breathing in, receiving, and breathing out, sharing. Goodwill. Let us bring this now to a close, being thankful for this moment together that we're sharing. Thank you. On the screen, as you came in, you saw prisms of faith. Think about a prism, a glass prism. Generally, we think about light coming through one side and coming out the other side dispersed in a spectrum of color. It's the same light, but now it's been changed, coming through that glass. And one way of thinking about this, and I didn't come up with the title for today, but it came up through the committee, but it's one that I use, but in a slightly different way. And I'd like to share both. So when I think about the different traditions, religious traditions, each one is a kind of prism through which that light comes, and it goes out the other side, and it's shared in the world. Does that make sense to you? I think of that as its mission. It's receiving light, and it's giving forth light. It's receiving its message of goodness, and it's sharing that with the world. And so we have these different traditions that are doing that. And even though they are particular traditions, at their core, they're sharing that light. And they're giving forth that light. That's one way of looking at it. But I'd like to push the envelope a little further. I'd like to see that prism not made up of just all the particulars, but of a prism of humanity, of all of us together. And yet, the light coming through shines through in different colors. And yet we're sharing the same light, but it's expressed differently. Expressed differently. The power in that, as I see it, is that we're conceiving of ourselves as humanity. And we're honoring the particularities, the variety. It's like seeing a field of flowers, of wildflowers. I used to live in Colorado, and up high, there were these beautiful fields of colors, flowers of different kind, wildflowers. And they were all partaking of the same space, but they were allowing their particularities to exist and to be seen. And it was beautiful. I'm offering these various images because they will pertain to where I'm going with all of this. Today is a commemoration, as I said, of the liberation of Jewish prisoners from the various camps. And so another image that I think is very important here is that of unveiling. Unveiling. a veil is something that covers something else, and you can't see what's on the other side until the veil is removed. And so I would like to play with this image today of unveiling, because I think the day of liberation was a day of unveiling. The soldiers went there for the purpose of liberating those who were captive, and that happened. But something else happened. What you saw is a part of what happened. In that, as they were liberating the people from the prisons, they also saw the horror. They saw the pain. They saw the suffering. And that was unveiled. They were not anticipating that the way they saw it. And that was greatly moving. And it touched them profoundly in the depths of themselves. The veil had been removed. They went there for one purpose, but they discovered something else. Profound suffering. And then it went beyond that, because the pictures that were taken were shown to the world. And there was yet another unveiling. The world was able to see what had not been seen. The world was able to see perhaps what had been denied. Or ignored. But the veil had been removed. And yet again, people were moved. And they could see how this people were so mistreated, tortured, suffered. And it began a new era within the life of a world, the sign that said that this should not happen again. This should not happen again. And so today, this event that we're sharing this afternoon is one of helping people of faith, people who are sharing the light coming through us, to reflect on what was going on there. When veils are removed, they give us an opportunity to ask some questions. Why was that? And how was it allowed to happen? And how can we do something, what needs to be done to avoid it again? And how shall we act? 4 things. Why did it happen? How was it allowed to happen? What can be done to prevent it? And what shall we do? How shall we respond? And so I intend to take us on a little journey about this. Though that experience was horrible, it was not the only experience that humanity has experienced horrible things. It was indeed hideous. But we've had a propensity for such horror for thousands of years. Think about your histories. Think about the various groups who have experienced horror, individually and as groups. It seems like there's something within our human nature that continues to perpetuate this action of violence. And so, how is it that we can interrupt that, eradicate it, change course, and learn other patterns? Unveiling moments have the possibility of transforming us. The soldiers were transformed when they saw what they saw. The world was transformed. There was even the United Nations that really grew out of that, after that. And Eleanor Roosevelt being involved with writing up, helping to guide the writing of documents that spoke about human needs. Other kinds of consciousness were raised in order to work differently. So what were some of the things that contributed to such a horror? Lack of understanding the other person, the other group, fear, I would say trauma. Groups having experienced trauma from the past, and because they're now afraid, they don't want to be open. And so then we begin to close in on ourselves in a way that does not allow for communication to happen. And we begin to imagine what the other is like. So it becomes a very isolated experience. Prejudgments are made about the other. We begin to form tribes, and we protect ourselves in that way. There are probably other kinds of things, but they're rooted largely in fear or in greed of wanting what the other has, at whatever cost that might be. And seeing whatever the thing is that we want being more important than the people who are affected by our greed. There may be other things, but those are two. The fear of something that's happened in the past that makes us draw back, or our desire to have what the other has. All of our traditions warn us against such things and help to guide us to another way. So we begin to think about safety. Safety. We all want to be safe. But even that is a precarious kind of thing, because I see safety going off in two different directions. One direction is that in order to be safe, I have to be isolated. Good fences make good neighbors. So if I can protect myself and be isolated, then I can be safe from you, whoever you are. And that can be played out in many ways. But then the other way of looking at safety is, how can we assure the safety of us all? How can there be ways to create an environment where we can all feel safe but not in the way of isolation, but in a way of mutual choices that we make. One of the images that I have about that is the line down the middle of a highway. I rarely ever drive my car totally afraid that the person on the other side is going to cross that line. That rarely crosses my mind. Why? Because there's an agreement that we have, all of us, that the line is there. And the line is for our mutual care, our mutual safety. I'm not afraid of you. It's just we've agreed that this line is here to keep us both safe. No animosity. I'm feeling great. You're feeling great. You're thinking about whatever you're thinking. You're going about your way. I'm going about my way. I might even wave at you while we pass. How can that be a kind of image? How can that be a kind of model that we could use amongst ourselves where we can be together and all feel safe, without animosity, without fear, but agreement about respect, about honor, about the care of all of us. I'm going to show you another experience. Let's see the moon and let's see the earth, but from a different perspective. Do you remember this? 1968. Astronauts seeing home from a different perspective. This became a big thing. So big until psychologists began to study the effect that it had on the astronauts. When the astronauts saw this, think about it. They are thousands and thousands of miles away from home. They're on the moon, and they're looking back at the earth. And it's awesome. It's awe-filled. And they see the earth in a way that they've never seen it before. They don't see political lines. They're not thinking about races. They're not thinking about ethnicities or political governments. They're seeing, as one liturgical, religious literature has it, this fragile earth, our island home. And it changes them. They see us. 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 And they come back with a totally different understanding about the earth and home and humanity as being all together right here. And so the job then is, how do we transfer what they experienced, perceived, into our experience of moving away, ending our sense of being isolated and afraid and eager to exploit others to understanding that this is our home. We're all living here. It even was one of the things that began the movement for the sustainability of our home, because they could see how fragile it was. So how do we get to this issue of oneness, not sameness? Unity is different from uniformity. That's a big difference. Unity. We can be together, but be very different. I think every family knows that. Come on. Within a family, the parents, are they all alike? I don't think so. And are all the kids the same? And yet, there's a sense of being together, right? United, but diverse. And to be able to hold that. And that happens when people within a family come to understand each other, know who each other is, and develop a sense of what we call empathy, knowing how the other feels, who's even different than we are. And that is the kind of quality that we need within the community, empathy. But that only comes through getting to know the other, conversation, time with the other, listening, and listening deeply. Part of the problem we have in listening is that we have our own agenda. We know what we want to say. And above all, we know what's correct, what's right. And so how can we have situations where we can listen more deeply with each other, to each other? Suspend, punch on hold. Remember those old telephones where you could punch on hold and talk to another person? But to punch on hold our own agenda in order to listen, deeply listening, not just to the words, but to try to hear the heart of the other. Why do they feel the way they do? What has happened? What is their story? And to share your story too. And in that, there can be developed what we call empathy. You may not agree with them on issues, but you come to understand where they're coming from. This kind of thing was very important to me when, after 9/11, I was pastoring in the Bronx, and there was great tension. You remember how it was in the country at that time. And it just so happened that across from our church was a group of Palestinians. They had been there for a long time, 3 houses of them. But they had never been over to the church. And I got to meet them, and I thought to my congregation, and I said, how would you like to meet some Palestinians? They thought I had lost my mind. And I said, no, really. It was a fascinating thing because 3 of them came, and the long and the short of it was that one of them was an English teacher in a high school in the Bronx. Another one was a merchant who sold accessories to cars. Another one was a woman who was a white American woman from Wisconsin who had converted to Islam. None of these fit. You get my point? None of them fit the stereotype. But they each told their story. And one of them said that when the attack happened, she was horrified because this was not, and when they found out who did it, this was not compatible with how she understood it was to be. And she was afraid herself. What happened as a result of that, having them come over to the church, was that we formed times of meeting with each other, along with a synagogue. So there were Episcopalians, Jews, Muslims, who began to regularly meet in each other's spaces and share each other's stories around food. Food. And even with the food, we had to be respectful, because some people wanted pork chops, and some people didn't. And some people wanted some scotch, and some people didn't. And so you get the point. We had to learn to honor and respect each other and still have fun. And it just so happened that these were people, many of whom were immigrants, either first or second generation. And so we thought, let's tell the stories about what it meant to come from one country into another country in small group. So we began to share those stories. And people began to hear that, this is very much like my story. And they experienced things very similarly to the way I did. And they began to make connections. And we began to go into each other's homes. Oh my. We ate the food there too. And we got to know the kids' names, how people lived. I think you get the point. It takes getting to know people and understanding their story. Why are they afraid? Why are they filled with sorrow? Why are they filled with rage? What are the stories behind that? And then what can we do to assure each other that we can be safe among each other? We may not be able to make a difference about things that are far away, but there's the old saying, bloom where you're planted, right here where you are. And what are the kinds of connections you can make? And it takes effort and courage to do that. These are some of the ideas that I leave with you, and let's put the moon back on, the earth back on the screen, and think about what it means that we are on this planet together. Think about what it was like when you began to feel the roots of the other in that first meditation. We're all a part of this earth. We're all here together. How can we make it safe for those who are around us? Thank you.
Bill Seamers has had a long tenure as rabbi at Congregation Beth Israel. His biography in the program attests that he has spent his career promoting understanding as he serves his synagogue. I can also confirm that Bill knows a whole lot more about St. Augustine than many who are supposed to know Augustine well. Bill.
Thank you, Bruce. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you on this occasion. Of course, it's all upside for me because you have to listen to me. And I made two friends. So it worked out very well for me. The theme of today is to be more than good neighbors. And in that line, I'll take advantage of the love which you received us with to lower the fences a little bit and to speak some things about to speak about some difficult things, but with the goal to bring us back to the place where the unveiling, the situation that we're in, it can bring us to conversations that we desperately need to have. My father-in-law was a refugee from Hitler's Germany. He and his brother and his parents escaped in 1939. He passed away about 15 years ago. In addition to all of the blessings that he provided for his family, he provided that his children and that all of his grandchildren would be able to return to Germany to visit the places where he lived, the country in which their family was from. The youngest of his grandchildren is my son, who recently observed his bar mitzvah. And it was this past summer that we made this trip to my father-in-law's home. For this trip back, before we left, we made certain that in our luggage or in our bags and our clothes, there was no ritual item, no book, no insignia, no article of clothing that would identify us as Jews. In the build-up to the election in Germany for the federal Bundestag they had a few weeks ago, I heard from both Jews and non-Jews that Germany is a role model in facing the Holocaust and coming to terms with the terror that the Germans visited upon the Jewish people. And I had to ask myself, what does it mean to be the role model in facing the Holocaust if Jews have to conceal their identity to travel safely? I asked this question again after the pogrom in Amsterdam, that when the police failed to protect the Jews, the Israelis basically suggested that they stay in their hotel rooms because they were not safe on the streets. Messages between the Israelis went viral in Jewish circles. There's a couple of tourist attractions in Amsterdam. I think Spinoza's old shul is there. There's the Rembrandt Museum. There's also the Anne Frank House. These conversations between Israelis. Tomorrow, will it be safe for us to visit the Anne Frank House? What does it mean? What is the statement of the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam if Israelis cannot visit it in safety? These and everything else took me back to a very difficult, a very challenging statement that Elie Wiesel made in 2005 at the dedication of some new branch of the Yad Vashem Museum in Yerushalayim. He warned about universalizing the Holocaust. He said that you hear that the Holocaust was man's inhumanity to man. It was man's inhumanity to Jews. What does that mean? What does that mean, and how can we face it today? What does it teach us, and how does it direct us into conversations that are going to be fruitful, and that are going to permit us to be more than just good neighbors to one another? To explore this, I'm going to give 3 reactions to Wiesel's statement that were made before he made the statement. 3 Jewish theologians. You probably know of one of them, Emil Fackenheim, but also Richard Rubinstein and Michael Weisselgrod. I'm going to spend just a little bit, maybe just a few sentences, some moments on Rubinstein and Fackenheim. But I think that what Weisselgrod has for us is very important. So I'm going to speak in some depth on that. Richard Rubinstein was actually a colleague of mine. We were in the same rabbinical union. He was a few years older than me. In the 60s, his work after Auschwitz was kind of a pioneer of the Holocaust signifies the death of God genre. Rubinstein wrote, and he believed all of his life, that intellectual honesty compels us not to blaspheme God by holding that he has a special relationship with the Jewish people that he either was unable or unwilling to fulfill in the hour of the Shoah. That was Rubinstein's response to Wiesel's dichotomy, man's humanity to man, or man's inhumanity to the Jews. Rubinstein believed that it was man's inhumanity to man, because when God disappears, the idea of Jews loses coherence as a category, as something that has to be explained. That the equation is reduced to a simple, depressing truth, because the presence of Jews, the problem that Jews pose, is annulled, and the term drops out of the equation. I have doubts that this position is much of what we are looking at today. That it's very difficult to describe the religious life that people have. It's very difficult to describe the lives that people who claim they don't have religion possess. We have this growing category of nuns, which affirm to be atheists, but they actually have views that we would classify as religious in some ways. But the real bottom line for Rubinstein is that fairly or unfairly, people don't really care about theodicy. It's not part of things that we worry about. Emil Fackenheim, God's Presence in History, his great work, agrees radically with the statement that Wiesel made decades later, that the central command, the charge, according to Fackenheim, out of the Holocaust, is that Hitler's victory cannot be allowed to stand, and that it is the commandment that is the imperative of Jews and non-Jews to deny this great evil that Fackenheim believes is going to sustain Judaism and define how Jews are seen in the eyes of non-Jews. So his statement is to agree that the Holocaust was man's inhumanity to Jews, and that it is this fact that is going to allow both people of faith, people of covenant, whether they are Jews or Christians, to together continue the fight for human rights and the survival of the Jewish people. Weiselgrode, like my father-in-law, left Germany in 1939 because I think this will be new and it's not easily summarized. I'm going to read a few excerpts from his relative work. It's a review, actually, of Fackenheim's book. I warn you ahead of time, this is going to be challenging. Weiselgrode writes, "It is necessary to recognize from any universally humanist framework, the destruction of European Jewry is one notable chapter in the long record of man's inhumanity against man. A record which compels the Holocaust to resign itself at being at most the first among equals in other atrocities. It is therefore a fact that if we remain fixated on the Holocaust, we have to find another reason. It is true that the Holocaust is our catastrophe as Jews, and one is entitled to mourn most intensely for the death of a relative than for that of another. But that consideration cannot have ultimate significance. On the psychological plane, such partiality is understandable. But on the final moral plane, all men enjoy the same dignity as my relatives, and it therefore follows that crimes against them cannot be qualitatively different from those against others. So from the point of view of non-belief, we have no choice but to disagree with what Elie Wiesel said. From the point of view of non-belief, according to Weiselgrode, we have to look at the Holocaust, at the Shoah, as man's inhumanity to man, simply another example, a tragic record. He does something here, and this is where it will become uncomfortable. He tells a story. A devout Catholic philosopher and my acquaintance returned from Mass one Sunday morning in a state of agitation. Some progressive members of the parish had removed the crucifix, and they had substituted for it a contemporary piece of art, sort of a cross. Instead of the suffering Jesus, there was affixed a collage depicting suffering Vietnamese men, women, and children. My friend was outraged. How can they, he asked, equate human suffering with the suffering of the incarnate Son, a person of the Godhead? I had no doubt of his deep and genuine compassion for the suffering of men, wherever it might occur. But it was only the suffering of the Son of God at Golgotha, he argued, that redeemed the sins of the world and healed the suffering of man. To substitute the suffering of man for this saving event was to confuse man with God, something that benefits neither. Must we not say something at least somewhat similar if we are to remain honest? The fate of Israel is of central concern because Israel is the elect people of God, through whom God's redemptive work is done in the world. However tragic human suffering on the human plane, what happens to Israel is directly tied to its role as the nation to which God attaches his name and through which he will redeem man. He who strikes Israel, therefore, engages himself in battle with God. And it is this reason that the history of the Jewish people is the fulcrum of human history. The sufferings of others must therefore be seen in the light of Israel's suffering. The travel of man is not abandoned precisely because Israel suffers, and therefore God's presence is drawn into human history, and redemption enters the horizon of human existence. If this sounds too religious for you, it sounds really too religious for me. But as I will return to in the end, I believe that this is, if not the path, that this is the direction that we are challenged to respond and to define ourselves as Jews, and to define our relationships with non-Jews. I do have to say, none of the theologians that I discussed fully address the situation that we have in front of us, because all three were concerned with what happens when knowledge of the Holocaust disappears. What's the consequence for the Jewish people and how we understand ourselves when the Holocaust is forgotten? The Holocaust has not been forgotten. The Holocaust is everywhere. Hitler has not been forgotten. Hitler is everywhere. And the Jewish people are in more danger than we have been since the end of the Second World War. The strengths of Weisselgaard's approach to us come to me in three ways. The first is that providing a Christian-Jewish structure for the conversation takes us to the strength that our traditions have. The vision of the moon, of the earth rising over the moon, and the wonderful recording of Bill Anders, of Frank Borman, and Jack Lowell reading from the book of Genesis on Christmas Eve to America. The universal God, the God that calls the stars by name, that looking from outer space might not even know us, might be unable to know us. How do we bridge the difference between the universal God and the God that loves people, the God that elects nations? Well, Jews do it twice a day. That every day before we study Torah, we recite a blessing for the God who is the universal, but also the God that loves peoples, the God that elects nations. Christians, whenever they study Psalms, work within this same tension. It is one of the undersold values of communities such as this, communities such as mine, that we provide a model for living within a tension as opposed to being consumed by attention, becoming undone by attention. And therefore, these are places, because of our unique heritage, where the lowering of fences and becoming more than good neighbors is possible. I started with thanks for being here, and I just want Bruce to know that these moments of encounter are very wonderful. They're beautiful. But the effect of what this does, it goes way beyond this. Just in the preparation, just thinking how we need to present to one another, doing the work of listening, the work of responding. Even before we got here, a tremendous opportunity to learn and to have conversations, and tremendous opportunities continue beyond this with the friendships made and the thoughts and the ideas explored, which is why I think that the growing this particular relationship and deepening this relationship is, whatever the theology behind it, going to be part of the story of the response to the situation that we are in. And finally, I wanted to close, part of the theme here is moving from tolerance to love and to radical acceptance. With Vishal Gord's actual prescription for how Jews and Christians should treat each other, how we should listen to each other, and the possibilities that exist if we are willing to accept each other. And all we have to do is do stuff that we've never done before. What could be easier? That interfaith dialogue, conversation for Vishal Gord, is to accept the validity of each other's covenants. Jews have never accepted that God can become incarnate in a person, and that this act of love is a way that God influences the world. Christians have rarely honored that God can also become incarnate in a nation, and that the distinctiveness and that the actual character of the Jewish people, not the way my good friend Augustine imagined them, but the ways that Jews actually live, that by honoring each other's covenants, doing these radical things that we've never done before, we can maybe be closer than we've ever been before. Thank you.
The Reverend James W. Nutter serves as priest at St. John's Church. He came to us from parish ministry in Maine and Texas, interrupted by a long intermediate career as a county executive in Houston. He brings with him a lifetime of observing human relations and human behavior, and a church career of reaching across faith boundaries to form relationships. Jim.
His name was Stuart. For a long time in my life, I was a gym rat. You all know what a gym rat is? And I met him at a gym in Houston, and 3 times a week we'd be there at the same time, and 3 times a week I would eat humble pie. And as people will do, he asked me, who are you and where do you come from and what do you do? And I said, I'm an Episcopal priest. Are you now? You don't look like one. And I said, well, who are you and what do you do? He says, I'm the headmaster at Emery Weiner School, which is a very elite Jewish school. And I think every one of the students had higher SAT scores than I did. And as we got to know each other over the months, he said, would you come and visit the school? And I said, anywhere I'm invited, I will go. He says, they're a rather challenging group. And I said, well, I face a congregation every Sunday. I said, do you want a program, Stuart? And he says, no, just come. They'll be the program. So he introduced me to close to 100 students. The whole high school was there. And Stuart says, does anybody have a question for this Christian priest? And a young lady rose her hand and she said, "Yeah, I've got a question. Why are you Christians so mean to us Jews?" We were often running. And I had to confess that we Christians very often dishonor the fifth commandment, and that is to love and honor our parents and our grandparents. And I see the Jewish people as our parents and our grandparents in the faith, and that Jesus was not the first Christian. Jesus grew up as a Jew, and we must never forget that. I stand here with more layers of grief than I can name. I also stand here with many layers of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for our scriptures themselves. The first 2/3 of our scriptures are their scriptures. The whole design of what we do on Sundays, we've borrowed. Is a combination of the synagogue service and the Passover service. There's no way to understand who we are and what we say as Christians other than that we stand, I don't want to say we stand upon their shoulders, because that's an up and down, but we must stand alongside of them. So I have all this thanksgiving and all this grief all at the same time. Excuse me. One of the great mentors of my life was a rabbi. His name was Harry Sky, and he was at Temple Bethel in Portland when I served there. And he had a reputation of being a little crusty and straight out of, I one time said in front of him the Old Testament. Oh man. I think it's the last time I said that. Not old to us, Father. Hebrew Scriptures. And he taught me a lot about Jesus. He taught me a lot about God. He taught me a lot about Scripture. And a combination of great thanksgiving and great grief I had at his house. He invited me over for Passover supper. And I said, well, I probably ought not to come in my uniform. And he says, no, I want you like that. So I'm there, and his son walks in and says, Daddy, why is he here? I can't be here if he's here. And as he began to walk out of the house, I said, Harry, this is for your family. I need to leave. And he says, you stay. And then he followed his son outside, and I didn't mean to, but you could hear their conversation. And he said, son, I've raised you better than this. He's our guest. And don't hold against this man how other Christians may have treated you. Son, I promise you, if you come back in, and please do, this man will honor you as a fellow child of God. And we shared Passover dinner together. Move with me, about 30 years later, I'm at another Passover supper. And his name was Carl. I was then working for Harris County. Being in parish ministry got me ready to do county politics in Houston. And I was given an assignment that people thought I was going to fail. Nutter, you have got to make downtown Houston more safe. Now remember, I'd only worked with altar guilds. And now I'm dealing with about 5 layers of law enforcement. The first person I picked to help me, his name was Carl Shaw. And it seemed like Carl knew everyone. And as I watched him work downtown Houston, he reminded me of the character Fiddler on the Roof. After we'd known each other for a few years, and as he helped make downtown Houston more safe, he invited me to his house. He was, I mean, no offense here, but people called him part of the Jewish mafia in downtown Houston. I mean, no, shalom. I didn't say it. And he said, come and say the Passover prayer for us. And there were about 50 people there in his family. And as we're getting ready for this event, Lucy, my sweetheart, my darling sweetheart, started doing some background on her genealogy. And she realized that she's 1/16, 1-something Jewish. And she'd never known. It was never talked about in the family. And as we're there together, I was called upon to say the prayer, and what an honor. What an honor. I didn't come in my uniform. Lucy began to cry because she'd never been part of a Passover where she knew that part of her identity was to be a Jewish person. And in that event and in that prayer, it was for her its own exodus from not knowing to knowing, from not knowing to claiming part of her roots. Carl and I became very close in all kinds of ways. When Hurricane Harvey overwhelmed Houston with 53 inches of rain, I was downtown working as a chaplain at a couple of the big buildings, and I found out that his neighborhood had been flooded. So in the midst of one of these days, he called me and said, I need you now. So I left downtown, went to his house in my uniform, and there were about 9 or 10 Jewish ladies there helping him clean up, and I walk in, and they're like, oh, well, what are you doing here? And Carl said, don't relax, he's my parish priest. Take off that shirt, though, and here's a t-shirt for you. And what an honor that was to be his parish priest. I have a dream. Does anybody here besides me wish that you were in charge? Come out of your denial. If I were in charge, I'd have this community, our land, our country, we'd all get on our knees and we'd do Bible study together on Genesis chapter 1. Remember the first day, the second day, the third, fourth. In the middle of the 6th day, God created men and women in his image and said, it's very good. And I pray that we could all kneel together and look at each other, regardless of our color, regardless of what we claim as our path to God, regardless of how we love, we could just look at each other and say, oh, you're my brother. You're my sister. And we're God's children together. The darkest spiritual moment I think I've ever had was at the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And before we spent a day there, I had all kinds of feelings and thoughts about Jews and Palestinians and Christians. You can't help but to ask questions if you're in the Holy Land. But going into the Holocaust Museum, you go in on railroad tracks. And you're meant to feel like you're on the train on your way to death. Several people in our party lasted about 5 minutes and had to turn around. And every time that I was tempted to turn around, I would sit down and stop and said to myself, I have to feel this as much as I can. And you see shoes, and perhaps the hardest ones to see were little baby shoes. And then you see glasses, and then you see gold fillings, and you see belts. The liberation of the camps was 80 years ago. But as Rabbi said, the Holocaust continues. And that doesn't take away anything from the horrific nature of that. But wherever there is hate, wherever there is racism, wherever there is prejudice, the Holocaust goes on, and we must see it. And we must deny it. And we must do Genesis chapter 1 together. And that everything that divides us, we must repent of. I was very sad during our briefing phone call for Rabbi Bill to say, we Jews feel abandoned by you Christians. Rabbi Bill, I made a commitment to you on behalf of this church. To the degree that we can, I pledge to you our support, that you feel our care, you feel our concern, you feel our sorrow, you feel our repentance, and that you feel that we are brothers and sisters with you, because we are the children of God together.
Noreen and Phillip Silver have devoted much of their careers to exploring the music of the Holocaust, finding what has been lost, publicizing what has been unknown, and playing music previously unheard. Dr. Silver.
We were very pleased to be invited to participate in this afternoon's events. And I would like to just say historically that my life seems to have revolved around this subject for centuries. even though it's only been decades. And I am very, very proud to have been able to find a niche to contribute a little bit to greater knowledge of the music that came out of this period, the music that was suppressed. And I want to just tell you how I got started in this. It's very, very brief. I had just become a faculty member at University of Maine, and this is over 2 decades ago. And there was a full-page ad in the student newspaper basically denying the Holocaust. And I had never seen anything like this before. I had been in Europe for many years, and I didn't see it there. And then I come to Maine, and it's here. And the realization was, what's going to happen when there's nobody living that can tell these people what the truth is, that can put them in their place? And that's unfortunately where we are right now. Well, in the sense that we have the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the camps, that means that the survivors don't have much time left. And we are at that place now where those who are denying the Holocaust are in the ascendance. And myself and some other people, we began to do things. The realization was, as musicians, what can we do? And basically, we can discover. We can discover works that were composed, and there was a tremendous amount. I won't go into it here, that's a different lecture, but the amount of opera, symphony, song cycle, you name it, that was composed in concentration camps and survived is unbelievably vast, unbelievably vast. But we began to look into this, and we began to find that there were composers, and if we hunted hard enough, we would make the right contacts. And thankfully, I must name one person who was very, very vital in this, David Bloch. He was in charge of musicology at Tel Aviv University, and David gave me the first leads as to what to do. And we realized at that point, if we did not play this music now, this was tantamount to killing these people a second time. And so we began to play, and we began to give them a face, not a number any longer, but a name and a face, and a voice with their music. And tonight, this afternoon, we gave 2 of those faces to you. And I just want to mention very briefly who they were, so you can at least leave with that knowledge. Aiden Bartosz was a phenomenal violist. He was brought to Israel to become the principal violist of the newly formed Philharmonic Orchestra, which is now the Israel Philharmonic. And for about 20 years, he was the principal violist of that orchestra. He also was one of the founders of the Rubin Academy of Music, the first major conservatory in Tel Aviv, which is now the Buchman Mehta School of Music. And he began to write music, Western music. You heard a bit of that tonight in the work Yizkor. But he also began to find ways of integrating Middle Eastern music into Western music. And he created a synthesis between the 2 languages. He also, well, let's put it this way. He wrote a lot of music. It is not often played, unfortunately. But when it is played, it is hopefully appreciated. The second composer we played tonight is someone who is very dear to my heart. I spent a lot of time working on this man's music. He's German-born, even though he has a very English name, James Simon. And Simon was somebody who his own son, the surviving son after the war, said he didn't live in the real world. He lived in a fairy tale world. His music, romantic, nothing modern about his music. His ability to see historically what was happening not there at all. He had the opportunity 3 times to get safety. He was offered an American visa, didn't take it. He was offered let me just think. Yeah, he was basically offered the American, and he was also helped. He could have gotten into Switzerland, he could have gotten into England. His son went into England. He refused to go. Why? Because he loved the German language and he couldn't see himself speaking anything else but German language. So in 1944, he was in exile in the Netherlands, which is where a lot of Jewish artists from Germany were hiding, and he was arrested, and he was sent to first Theresienstadt, Terezin, and then to Auschwitz. He was never entered into the book of arrivals at Auschwitz, so we know he was sent directly to the gas chambers. We also have this wonderful anecdote. There was a newspaper published in New York after the war, Second World War, called Der Aufbau. It was for German immigrants in America, and there was an article, Remembrances of James Simon. And I'll never forget the last sentence of it, in which he says he was last seen sitting on his suitcase scribbling musical notes. This would have been in Auschwitz on the way to the gas chamber. So that's James Simon. That's somebody that we've spent a lot of time investigating, and we actually happily put on the first all James Simon program with music a few years back in Amsterdam. So I just want to say one other thing, that when it comes to music, it was essentially important to the people in the camps. But also, and James Simon is the clear example of why this must be true, we must transcend all art, and we must also look and see not just what we want to see, hope for the best, but we have to prepare for the worst. Because what's happening outside our doors is not very promising. Thank you.
We will conclude in a few moments with 2 program dedications and a whole lot of thank yous. But before we get there, I want to have an interactive part of the program. I'm going to detach this microphone. I'm going to invite any of you who have an observation, a question, a reaction, a response, a question for one of the panelists, and I hope that if you are moved to speak, you will. Bear in mind, this is a very complicated subject, and I don't want you to hesitate to present a half-formed thought. We'll make sense of it, they'll make sense of it, and they will respond to it in a way that I hope will advance the presentations made thus far. One other thing, in a fractious and chaotic world, there are a lot of places and subjects that require close attention. The Middle East, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, all around the world. But those topics are not our topic. If we start to talk about one of those topics, it will swallow the topic that we are on. So I will thank everyone for remaining focused. I'm just going to detach this microphone. If you are moved to speak, please so indicate, and I will get it to you.
Hi, thank you all for your for speaking this afternoon. Thank you, Reverend Nutter and Bruce, for welcoming me, to this beautiful house of worship. I wanted to bring up two thoughts, 2 reactions. The first, Reverend Nutter. Oh, who am I? It's a deep question, Bruce. My name's Sam Weiss. I'm the rabbi down the street at Congregation Bethel. My first thought of two, I'll try to keep them both brief. The first is about something you said, Reverend Nutter, about the Holocaust being alive wherever there is hate, wherever there is prejudice. I worry about sentiments like these. It seems to me something akin to saying wherever there is an air disaster, there is 9/11. This was a profound, evil, abysmal event. Yes, there are contributing factors that are alive and well in each of us, in the heart of every person, and always has been. But it was true that there was hate and there was prejudice directed against all sorts of people, but certainly against Jews before the Holocaust. And yet we had no awareness of something like Holocaust until there was Holocaust. And so I wonder how we deal with that. Whether there's maybe the answer is something like unity without uniformity. That we incorporate an awareness of the Holocaust and all of its horrifying particularity into the story, into our shared story, without forcing everything that is Holocaust-y, prejudiced, somehow hateful into that category. That's my first reaction. My second has to do with the metaphor of unveiling. I thought that was very powerful, Reverend. But I became uncomfortable sitting here just offering my reactions to the images on the screen while Phillip and Noreen were playing of these emaciated Jews being unveiled to the world as an image of suffering with a capital S. You used the word suffering. And I worry. I think that I worry about the Jews living in the modern consciousness in that way, accepted as a symbol of suffering, but not accepted, not seen as a symbol of survival. Each of those men depicted, I only saw men, but of course there were children and there were women, had a well of power that I'm beyond my comprehension, and so I aspire to perhaps the next chapter of how we remember the Holocaust in the West is something like recognizing not only Jewish suffering but also Jewish power, and the power and creativity of all people. Thanks.
Thank you, and I will speak to that in a moment. Anyone else?
Yes, I'd like to even respond to you. Can you hear me? I'm doing a project right now using the image of refuge as a category, writings that I'm doing. And I relate to what you're saying, in that in the story of my own people, of African Americans, first of all, when I was seeing those photographs, it was evoking some deep stuff within me about those stories as well, okay? But in the writing I'm doing about refuge, in my own context, I'm seeing the suffering of the people of my heritage as being also an example of incredible strength. Incredible strength. And so I seek refuge, personally, in that kind of strength, of resistance and of verve in the midst of horror. So it's both things. I hope you hear what I'm saying. I'm resonating profoundly with what you're saying, that it should not, I should not, and I don't see it only as suffering, but as strength. However, I think there is such value in people getting in touch with the horror of it. That's why I was emphasizing that, yeah.
There was two parts. Sam, glad to see you. I think that as a Christian person, I feel totally inadequate to try to talk about the Holocaust. That it's something the Jewish people went through that is unique to your people. There were other people who were killed, but the intent was to exterminate all of your people. And that's the evil and darkness that I felt. And that's its own unique thing. And I don't think that unless you're Jewish, you can begin to take it in. And maybe even as a Jewish person, it's hard to take in. What I was trying to say is not take anything away, but for us not to see the Holocaust simply as a historical event, but that the threads of hate and prejudice continue on. And my prayer is what that was about, we can learn from it in a way that we can, together as God's children, fight against the darkness. And it's not simply history, it's a moment. And it's one that extends into our own time and place. But I was not for one moment meaning to round off and connect everybody else with what that was. And if you heard that, I meant no dishonoring of what that was. But I wanted to say, we're not just simply talking about history. And there's echoes of us having to look at the newspaper today. And where do we see darkness, or where do we see prejudice, or where do we see any kind of unfairness? And that it strengthens us to face into it with light and hope now.
Anyone else? I'm looking out in the dimness. Oh.
Of the Jewish community in Bangor. How many in this room, raise your hand, had a relationship with John Brett Ford? Well, a few people. That's my first comment. My second comment is that I was about 12 years old when Rabbi Stephen Weiss came to Bangor and spoke over there at the Jewish Community Center. We had a procession carrying the Torahs around, and everybody, the building was full. They had speakers in all the classrooms, and everybody seemed to be in a celebratory mood. And about 2 minutes into his talk, everybody was crying. We did not know about the Holocaust. Even though I was quite young at the time, it was a well-kept secret, except from the government. The government knew. But hopefully that's one thing that would be one reason to have something like that happen again, is the communications in the world are a lot more sophisticated than they were. But thank you for the opportunity to be in John Brett Fort's house.
Thank you, Billy.
Hi. I know that this is about the Holocaust, but it's been mentioned many times that these things are happening now. And when I looked at all those pictures, it reminds me of the Israeli hostages that were in captivity for a year and a half, and how they were paraded in front of everybody on the day that they were released, frail and emaciated. And so these things are not only happening in the past history, but these atrocities happen even now, every day. So that's what I want.
Yes.
Rabbi Bill recommended that we go into places of discomfort. And I want to tell about one such experience that I thought would just be terrible, but it turned out to be one of the most greatest experiences of my life. And I've had some pretty good experiences. Anyway, there was a lady who lived down in Belfast, but she came up here to the synagogue on York Street. And she sat next to me one day at a meeting, and we were all singing, and she said, "I want you to come and sing in the choir at the synagogue." So I said, okay. And she sent me pages of music to practice at home before I showed up. And I know that I was useful because when it was time to turn on the lights, or other things like that, I was useful. I could look for the cookware that they needed. Couldn't do it because it was Saturday. Anyhow, I wanted to say that sometimes the things that we think won't be so good turn out to be among the better things that happen to us. So for 1 year, I sang in the synagogue choir. I wouldn't sing in the choir here, but I did there.
That's just one of many ways you're useful.
Turn it on the lights. Really good at that.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. My name is Joe Diavanzo, and I attend, I think, every type of congregation in Maine. That's what I've always done. From the Mormons down the Jewish temple to the Catholic churches. Today I was at the Methodist church, and your dad was never in New York, was he? I have the books from the Amedelia Temple in Hollis, Queens on Palo Alto Street, and I had attended there a few times as far as the Armenian Orthodox Church, a Jewish temple there. And I think I was the only one actually who knew and developed a friendship with the Zoroastrians, okay, and whom I consider to be the grandfathers of all of the religions today, since possibly even Abraham was a Zoroastrian. My question is, not a question, well, on the way up here today, this morning, I went to church at the Methodist, and he was talking his sermon about what's wrong with the world today. He says that our religions, all three religions, should be getting together and understanding not only each other, but should be reacting to each other in the same way, and we're not. On the way up here, of course, I think it's St. Teresa's in Brewer, and I'm going there, and there's a little crowd, and who's standing out there in his robe? Man I've met a few times. The bishop from Portland was up here, Bishop Rogeri. Why? He was there. I guess he was giving a talk. And I said, gee, today's quite a day. It's turning out to be. Everywhere I'm going, there's something going on. My question or my disturbance, we're praising ourselves or we're talking about ourselves as if it's us or my neighbor who has to get along. I think the real failure is the religious leaders. And I don't mean you, I mean the leaders of each faith. There are my good friend Father Joe in Ellsworth. I've met his mother on phone because she lives in Cameroon, that's where they are from, and he's here. And the persecution against Christians that are going on in Africa and these countries isn't even really reported. Don't know if it's because they're Christians or because they're black Christians. I mean, who cares? And I hate the word black because he would say, we're not black and you're not white. We're all a different shade of brown. And I don't see how any of this can ever stop. I mean, if you want to go to the Bible, we could look at towns and everybody being destroyed. When are the leaders of all the different, whether it's the Pope, everybody has got together and take command of their people and ask and tell them they cannot act in a certain way? Maybe then the governments can change, because the government's really only interested in the money, and we all know that. But if our leaders don't take command, we can have small congregations, but it's not going to make much of a difference.
I think we got time for one more, if there's one more. There we go.
I will confess to being the atheist among the group, but I also sort of see myself as a bridge. My name's Hillary Clark, by the way. I'm a tax accountant in Bangor. I was raised a Baptist, and my father was raised a Baptist, and he converted to Judaism when he married my stepmother. And so he converted and then became gradually more Orthodox and is now a practicing Hasidic Jew and lives in Israel. I have 2 sisters in arranged marriages. I have 2 gay brothers. So I am effectively a practicing bridge, and then there are 2 atheists among us in the family. And I guess I would say to all of you that are people of sort of practicing of faith, and you have this idea of yourselves as the chosen people, I see it from the perspective of that if there is no afterlife, if this is all that there is, the sort of the Asimovian school of humanism, that the central greatest thing that you can do is human kindness, because that's all that there is. And so I would propose in sort of bridging that gap, more the question of proposing what if we're wrong, and also disengagement, not holding on to your beliefs quite so tightly. Because in not holding on to those beliefs quite so tightly, it's how you're able to grasp other people's beliefs. And sort of when you're closed down, hunched in on yourself and your beliefs, you can't really expand your thoughts to agree or disagree with other people and accept that they have validity.
All right, we are now drawing to the close of the program. I do invite everyone to come downstairs for food and drink and further discussion. The speakers will be present, and I'm sure they'll be glad to meet you and follow up on ideas presented this afternoon. We are dedicating this program to 2 persons. They are both members of the generation of Jewish Americans who came of age as World War II ended and the Holocaust was revealed. They found out as teenagers what the world could do to them and how fragile was their reliance on the community around them. Yet they flourished. I imagine to them it was simply a matter of living the lives they were given, but to me, they and their generation demonstrated unfathomable courage. Norman Minsky was born in 1930 and is, I hope, with us today on the live stream. Norman is a lifetime Bangorian and civic stalwart who has served the community in many ways, as a highly respected lawyer, as city councilor and mayor, as state representative, and as an unflaggingly reliable supporter of education and the arts. Please do note his taste in neckwear. I should also mention that Norman lived in the house in which he was born until he was 55, at which time he sold it to a young couple with 2 tiny children. He delivered a bottle of sparkling wine to the buyers at the closing to make sure they had a fitting celebration. Norman, I still remember the brand. Thank you for that, and thank you for much else. Gerald Rudman was born in 1928. He died in 2013. He became a lawyer, the son of a lawyer and judge, and the brother of a lawyer and judge. He never became a judge. He never held public office. He was simply a great man. He volunteered. He gave blood. He and Judy raised their family. He ran his law firm and inspired generations of younger colleagues to emulate his qualities of legal brilliance, diplomatic polish, and unerodable integrity. In 1967, after their father had departed practice for the bench, Jerry and his brother Paul joined in practice with their friend Gene Carter, and thereby ruptured local custom by forming Bangor's first Jewish Gentile law firm. That happened when I was 11 or 12. By the time I joined Jerry's law firm 13 years later, it was old history. It was known to me, and it was valued, but it was not deeply appreciated. I wish I had thought to ask him about it when I could. But I can imagine the event. No fanfare, no proclamation, just Jerry making his move and sitting back with an enigmatic smile while the world around him blinked and then adjusted and then changed. One more note. Jerry was not a pious man, but one day I was in his office and noticed a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures on a shelf. I mentioned it. He took it down and he gave it to me. And it has been on every office shelf I have ever had since. Thank you, Jerry. Many other thanks to Elizabeth Reinecke for her great-grandfather's paintings and permission to use them, and to Bill Hiss for leading me to Elizabeth, to the heirs of Alfred Cantor for use of the images in the book of Alfred Cantor, to Dolores Landry and the St. Andrew's Guild for the reception to which we are heading, to Eric Boberg for technical wizardry, Leanne Maloney for graphics, and everyone in the parish who has helped with this program. Thank you to Phillip and Noreen Silver. Thank you, Father Jim. Thank you, Bill Seamers. And thank you, Father Masud. Everyone, please go out and be a light.